that on? Yeah, just checking. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this public panel event that's titled, Is Foreign Aid Still Relevant? The event has been co-hosted by the Stevenson Trust and the Scottish Council on Global Affairs. So just a quick note on us. The Stevenson Trust provides education on civic rights, responsibilities, encourages research into governance and political structures, and promotes the idea that local and national patriotism can coexist with international cooperation. Information on the Stevenson Trust is available online via the University of Glasgow website. The Scottish Council on Global Affairs, National Hub for Policy Relevant Research and Informed Non-Partisan Debate on Foreign and Security Policy, founded by the Universities of Edinburgh, Glasgow, and University of St Andrews. The Council is currently sponsoring a series of events as part of its State of the World project, taking stock on global affair topics and thinking about the implications for Scotland within this. These include migration, biodiversity loss, and the focus of tonight's event on foreign aid. So I'm here representing a team of researchers working to document and promote understanding of the current context of foreign aid and what Benoit Felice, co-director of the Centre of African Studies at the University of Edinburgh, Graham Young from the Division of Urban Studies and Social Policy at the University of Glasgow, and myself, Matt Barlow, and Ben Hunter from the Division of Political and International Studies, where we'll be launching a new MSc in Global Development this September. So, here in Glasgow, we have the extraordinary privilege of being an international city, close to the Scottish Government, and the UK's foreign, Commonwealth and East Kilbride, with deep connections to many regions and institutions around the world. So we've brought together this panel tonight of experts to talk around a series of perspectives on aid and its role within a wider set of ways for paying for international development. So we'll use the first half of this event this evening to collect those perspectives from each of the panelists in turn before inviting further questions from the sounded weird. And there will be no record, from the audience after everyone has spoken. One of the points to note is that this event is in hybrid form and it's taking place for registered participants only. And we've been asked by the panelists that there be no recording of tonight's presentations or discussions or sharing these on social media. So I'll shortly hand over to our first panelist, Rulani Ramella. Rulani is a PhD candidate at the University of York, that's where I'm from, University of Glasgow, working at the intersection of development finance, political economy of inequality, and financialization in the global south. Her PhD research examines how the experience of debt shapes and is shaped by race, gender, and class in the context of South Africa. Prior to joining Glasgow last autumn, Rulani spent over 10 years as a development professional and specialist in monitoring, evaluation, and research, including work with the German aid agency, GIZ, the international NGO, FHI 360, and the Presidency of South Africa. She led and designed evidence systems, results frameworks, and policy research across large-scale governance, employment, and institutional development programs in Southern Africa. And it's from this perspective of someone who has worked in this sector and witnessed and experienced changes firsthand that Rulani will speak tonight. So over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and good evening, everybody. So I will kick off the discussion by saying this. I believe that foreign aid or international development in general has a PR problem. The reason why I say that is because I don't think we would be having this conversation if it was clear the value that we bring in terms of what it is that we do. I know currently there's a lot of rhetoric around, it's a waste of funds, it's funding nefarious things, but if we actually had good PR and actually communicated better what it is that we do, I think there would be a much different conversation that we're actually currently having. Based on that, I want to draw on my experiences within the field. So I was very lucky in the sense that I worked at a very high level, policy level, where we worked with such as the World Bank, the French Development Agency, as well as other very large international organizations, where we developed a project that was looking at youth unemployment as a policy intervention in South Africa, because we're very high unemployment rate. And just based on that experience, I could see how what it is that we are doing when we cooperate so when people say these programs and this foreign aid is not useful, it's not making the difference that it wants to make, that is untrue because I've seen it. Of course, not every single intervention is great and makes a difference, but there are interventions that actually do make a difference. So that's on a more higher level. Look, going down to the implementation level where you're working with smaller organizations, that's actually where you see the real effects, the real impact on the individual on the ground. You know, you work in an organization and they, for example, they provide a training, and then you see this young person now going into employment. You actually then see how it is that improving the living situation for one individual, how it has an effect on a household. In South Africa, more often than not, one person will support about 5 or 6 people in a household. So just making a difference, getting that one person into employment actually makes a huge difference to not just that person, but to the whole entire household. And obviously that has ripple effects in terms of the broader economy and so forth. So when we question whether foreign aid is still relevant, for a person who has worked in the space and has seen the difference, it's an obvious answer to me. It is relevant. We do actually need it in some way, shape, or form. Like I said, there's issues that we might want to address within the space, but it is relevant. We do need it. So in terms of the immediate cuts in terms of aid, I think we're all aware that USAID was shut down. And I know that there is quite a lot of discussion in terms of what's going to happen with the beneficiaries, which is very much correct. But I think that another thing that we also need to think about that's not actually spoken very often in the media is actually the impact on those who actually work in the sector, right? So first of all of those people who were in the sector, they obviously are now unemployed. Beyond the effects of unemployment, we are losing a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise and skills and understanding of how certain context works and how certain interventions work in certain contexts. That kind of knowledge is now being lost. Very much closely linked to that is the fact that myself as a monitoring and evaluation and research person, the data, the longitudinal studies that we were doing at the time, they've all been lost. So I don't know how aid will come back, but it's going to take some time to then rebuild that knowledge infrastructure for the sector. And still on the point of the effects of those who have actually lost jobs, these are also people who contribute to their local economies. And now, while they were in the position of actually helping, they are also now vulnerable. And the effects of them contributing to their local economies, a lot of them actually come from low and middle income economies. Now, also that's money that's being pulled out of their local economies. So there's quite an effect also, not just with the beneficiaries, but also with the people who actually work within the sector. In terms of the fallout, I will speak specifically to what has happened within health in South Africa. We were funded by USAID. About 17% of our budget in South Africa came from USAID. It funded things such as ART, antiretrovirals, TB interventions, and as well, it also funded a lot of research trials and studies in terms of HIV. So what happened when that funding was actually pulled is that a lot of studies were canceled, and then there was also this huge gap in terms of how we're now going to provide ARVs, etc. In South Africa, the government was able to step in, but they weren't able to fill that gap entirely in terms of provision of ARTs. And as well, similarly, a lot of people also lost jobs. I think it was about 8,000 healthcare workers who then lost jobs. But beyond those jobs that were lost, a lot of people now don't have access to ARTs and TB intervention, which of course, time will tell what the effects of that is actually going to be. So very lastly, in terms of what are sort of the midterm and long-term challenges that we are facing, I think that for in the midterm, obviously, for let me look at it from the perspective of a government, it's finding the money to fund those very key interventions that have been cut off by the cutting off funding of USAID, looking at how are you going to continue ensuring that ARVs and ARTs are also being rolled out. For organizations, there's one organization that I was actually consulting with, and they found that they were overly reliant on USAID and the State Department in the US for funding. And when that funding was pulled, they collapsed, basically. So now in the midterm, they were thinking, okay, how do we strategize moving forward in that we can't be reliant on one source of funding, but we need to diversify. And I spoke to them recently, they said they're now working with the EU and the Netherlands and all of that, trying to sort of diversify where it is that they get their funding. So just to conclude, I think I've spoken quite a bit. So just to conclude, I think that in general, international development is at that inflection point, right? What happened was very unfortunate, and it shouldn't have happened the way that it happened. It should have been done in a more strategic way, where you sort of taper it off, not just cut it off overnight, because the effects, as I've mentioned, are quite a lot, and also we're still going to see different kinds of effects as time moves. But I do think that for global South governments, right, and also thinking moving forward for ODA donors in terms of how you move forward, it will be important that we look at aid differently, right? Aid, I don't believe, should substitute your budget as a country. It should be something that helps. And I think long-term, the thinking should be around how is it that if we ever get to that place where there was a lot of ODA money that was flowing, if we ever get back to that, how is it that we maximize the returns to aid in such a way that we get to a place as a global South where we're no longer necessarily dependent on foreign aid? But yeah, those are my opening thoughts.
Thank you very much, Joanna. They were yes, very insightful. Thank you for that. And thank you for going first. I really appreciate that. So to our second intervention now, we're actually going to be joined online. Our second panelist is Dr. Adize Ore, who will be joining us. She's a consultant family physician, public health specialist, and recently concluded a posting as Honourable Commissioner for Health in Rivers State, Nigeria. Prior to that appointment, she was a pioneer country director of planning, research and statistics for Nigeria's National Blood Service Commission and a senior health policy advisor with Nigeria's Federal Ministry of Health. She advocates for respectful quality healthcare, health equity, universal health coverage, and was invited to share her perspectives at the 74th United Nations General Assembly in 2019. In 2021, she was one of 15 accomplished Amuje leaders in Africa, awarded by the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf Presidential Center for Women and Development, and has been named, it's a long bio, as one of this day's 50 power women in Nigeria, Business Day's 50 most inspiring women in Nigeria. She has written over 125 publications on health systems and policy in peer-reviewed journals and mainstream media, and is co-author of Lessons Life Has Taught Me and Sickle Cell Disease in Sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Adize will be speaking from the perspectives of how countries are responding to recent events and the prospects for future.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to join in this very important conversation at a very critical time in world history. Thank you, Matt, for that bio. Apologies for the length. And good evening. So my leadership in public health and close-up interaction with foreign aid began in 2009, when I was coordinator in charge of the National Blood Transfusion Service for Abuja, Nigeria's Federal Capital Territory, Nasarawa State, and Niger State, both states in northern Nigeria. And this was a project in collaboration with the Federal Ministry of Health, funded via development aid by the United States government through the US CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. So my role then was critical to National Blood and Emergency Services policy formulation. And if we think about that time, that was kind of at the point where Boko Haram was getting a very strong hold in northern Nigeria as well. So blood services, operations, supervision, data analytics and management, quality assurance, and emergency preparedness and response, because we had to do a lot of blood service provision in those conflict-affected parts of the country. In 2020, right then during the COVID-19 pandemic, I published an opinion piece with Premium Times that was titled, "What Becomes of Africa as Foreign Aid Taps Run Dry?" And of course, in writing that piece, I did hope that there would be some kind of preparation or proactiveness on the parts of national governments in the global south. But unfortunately, we had to revisit that piece 5 years later with another op-ed in Nairametrics titled "Beyond Aid, Cultivating Self-Reliance in Africa's Healthcare Landscape." I led Rivers State's health sector to win the Gates Foundation, UNICEF, and Aliko Dangote Foundation-sponsored Primary Healthcare Leadership Challenge for the South-South region of Nigeria 3 years in a row, with a total winning prize of $1.5 million US. And so part of my interventions will also be speaking about the impact of foreign aid on primary healthcare. So when we talk about the value of foreign aid, for Nigeria, the United States has been one of the largest and most reliable sources of foreign aid. And our country received in 2023 upwards of $1 billion US, making Nigeria the 7th largest recipient of US foreign assistance. And this aid played a key role in healthcare, education, governance, infrastructure, humanitarian relief, and even economic growth, with several interventions to grow medium to small scale businesses across the country. Similarly, Nigeria was the 6th largest recipient of UK official development assistance in the same 2023, with over £100 million allocated to a country. This was a reduction from 2022, when Nigeria received £110 million from the UK. By 28th of January 2023, PEPFAR marked its 20th anniversary. And in that time, it had invested over $100 billion US in the global fight against HIV and AIDS, and supported more than 20.1 million people on HIV treatment in over 50 countries globally. In Nigeria, over $7.8 billion US had been disbursed by PEPFAR to ensure that over 1.9 million Nigerians who were living with HIV and AIDS had comprehensive access to quality HIV prevention, care, and treatment services. This laying the groundwork for the eventual eradication of HIV. When I led that joint PEPFAR-funded Federal Ministry of Health project for blood services in northern Nigeria, I saw how heavily we rely on aid, especially from the US. Even from going through the cooperative agreements, it was clear that this aid was time-bound. Those were specified in those cooperative agreements. And so I always used to wonder why, years down the road, up to a decade after those agreements were signed, the country was still completely reliant on aid. And so when in about 2014, 2015, that grant was pulled, we were left in a flux. And I was like, why are we confused? Why were we unprepared? These were stated clearly, categorically in the agreement. And so a lot of ongoing costs in the health sector in Nigeria has been largely reliant on foreign aid. With the second largest number of people living with HIV globally, PEPFAR provided HIV treatments for up to 90% of Nigerians living with HIV and AIDS. For over 1 million HIV-infected children and 48 million people infected with malaria, aid from the US covered full cost of their treatment, their care, and their support. And these assistance programs led to reducing mortality of children under the age of 5, increasing immunization coverage, and even sponsoring family planning programs for preventing millions of unintended pregnancies. And when you think of Nigeria being projected to exceed 400 million from our present 230 plus million by the year 2050, you can see the importance of these sponsored family planning programs. Additionally, aid has been beneficial in food security, education, security, and social welfare and rehabilitation. So for the immediate impact of these aid cuts, severe food insecurity and malnutrition, increased vulnerability to insecurity, health system disruptions, community testing for HIV halted in many communities, disrupting services for orphans and vulnerable children, threatened the supply of essential medicines for malaria and other diseases such as tuberculosis and neglected tropical diseases. And one thing to highlight about the vulnerability to insecurity is that that reduced support for populations that had been displaced from areas of conflict actually potentially forces many of these community members into desperate situations, potentially increasing their recruitment into extremist groups like Boko Haram. And then, of course, there's the educational sector disruption of social services such as water, sanitation, and hygiene. And of course, the concomitant economic strain with withdrawal of aid, fueling of local economy, which has been fueling a lot of local economies in the Northeast. This economic stagnation and job losses, as referred to by my preceding speaker, leaves these places that had been reliant on the humanitarian sector for ongoing economic activity, leaves them extremely vulnerable to worsening poverty. So for the fallout of the aid cuts, with the announcement that happened in February 2025, several things took place immediately. There was an immediate assessment of the stock levels across the country. Fortunately, at the time of the announcement, there were at least 2 months of stock at the health facilities and 5 months of stock at the central warehouses. New shipments based on orders that had been placed prior to the announcement and payments that had already gone out were expected to gradually continue. But the worry was now about distribution challenges, getting these commodities when they arrived to the last mile, and ongoing orders and stocking of facilities and warehouses. The depletion of the community health workforce. For us in Rivers State, it wasn't as bad. We had a volunteer workforce paid by USAID in the region of just below 1,000, so about 900 plus volunteers of community health workers. But in some states, for example, Bauchi in northern Nigeria, that workforce was up to 25,000. So just imagine, overnight, 25,000 community health workers lost their jobs. By March, of course, with the announcements, by the following month, with the announcements, there was growing public distrust. And that has been one of the major issues that we've had to contend with since those aid cuts. Worries from communities about how to continue to receive care, treatment, and even prevention services. By January 2026, the World Food Programme announced that an urgent requirement of $129 million to sustain its operations in Northeast Nigeria for the next 6 months. And I wanted to also share something that was said by the country director of the World Food Program in Nigeria, David Stevenson. And he was saying that if the World Food Program cannot continue supporting displaced populations in camps, these populations will leave the sites in a desperate attempt to survive. This was something I mentioned a little earlier. They will try to migrate, or worse, they may join insurgent groups in order to feed themselves and their families. So several response actions have taken place. The Nigerian government has taken a few proactive steps to address the potential gaps, especially with regards to HIV and AIDS. In 2025, the Federal Executive Council approved 4.8 billion naira, which is about 3.5 million US dollars, for procuring 150,000 HIV treatment packs under a HIV program alignment. That was one of the immediate responses. And then government started collecting information about healthcare workers that had been impacted by the funding freeze, with the intention to determine critical numbers and skill sets in each state for recommendations for absorption into the public health workforce. When we think of Nigeria's governance structure, we have the federal government, which is the national government, and then we have the subnational, which are the states. So states in themselves also started taking some measures to plug these health workforce gaps. For our state in Rivers, we recruited 2,000 health workers, 1,000 specifically for communities, and then 1,000 to provide referral services through the teaching hospitals. Absorbing a lot of, in fact, we were able to absorb majority of those community health workers that were left unemployed following the funding freezes. Several other states also carried out these health worker employment initiatives. Yobe State in the north, Niger State also in the north, and Ogun State in the south, which Ogun State is right next to Lagos State. The network of people living with HIV has also been leading efforts to map the impact on the community health workforce, supporting government teams to review findings and ongoing proposals for state-level interventions. So these response actions have been directed at enhancing access to antiretroviral treatments, so of course funded by government with some support from the Global Fund, making sure that the pipeline for first-line antiretrovirals remains strong with over 6 months of stock available. And just this month, the Federal Executive Council once again approved an increased amount, this time 10 billion naira, about double what was approved last year, which equates to about 7.4 million US dollars, to strengthen HIV/AIDS treatment by procuring directly antiretroviral drugs to sustain free treatment services and address the fears and the public mistrust I had referred to earlier for due to the nationwide drug shortages. The government is also trying to focus on strengthening national systems, securing local financing, and engaging the organized private sector in the country more, including plans to establish an AIDS trust fund. So for the challenges, I would like to address the challenges from two directions. One, the challenge to our country in terms of domestic resource mobilization, and then the challenge with regards to securing and sustaining ODA. So for the domestic resource mobilization, we as a country have an over-reliance on oil revenues, which can be very volatile, especially now we see what's happening in the Middle East. And these also translate to a lot of the economic factors, low per capita income generally in the country. And with these escalating oil prices, stock crashes, high inflation, currency depreciation, there's a weakened ability to mobilize resources domestically. We have a very large informal sector. A significant portion of economic activity occurs in the informal sector that's not adequately tracked and therefore not really taxable. this places a disproportionate burden of tax on the very small, organized formal sector. There's weak tax administration and corruption with inadequate database management and administrative capacity limitations, corruption within tax authorities, which hinder efficient tax collection. And we've also failed to significantly explore taxes for alcohol, tobacco, and sugar-sweetened beverages. There have been conversations around this, but no concrete action around it, and I mean, for obvious reasons. Low tax morale, tax compliance is low because many citizens don't see the tangible benefits of their tax contributions in public infrastructure or services. Tax system complexity and exemptions. There are complex tax rules. Late last year, there were announcements about a tax reform. Much of the population do not understand what this tax reform is all about and the implications for their day-to-day lives, but government seems to be going forward with those tax reforms. And so you have a high volume of discretionary exemptions for corporates, for companies that undermine the revenue base. And then, of course, trade misinvoicing, fraudulent invoicing in international trade that negatively impacts the volume of domestic resources. Then for the challenges to securing and sustaining foreign aid, corruption and mismanagement within the aid sector is definitely one of the things that will be forefront, uppermost in the minds of anyone seeking to engage with the country in terms of extending foreign aid. Transparency International ranked Nigeria 154th out of 180 countries in 2021. These are important statistics that any hopeful or intending ODA organization would be looking towards. How do we extend aid and ensure that it is not undermined by corruption and mismanagement? Aid dependency and economic distortion. We have a very heavy reliance on foreign aid, particularly in the health sector, where 62% of the budget historically has been donor dependent, which discourages domestic revenue generation and undermines self-sufficiency. So for states, for even the national government, once a sector, for example, HIV, ARV treatments, have been identified as being donor funded, there is less likelihood of the responsible government to take ownership and invest funds or resources in that particular area. The impression is, well, it's donor funded, why would we want to duplicate? Of course, we're in an environment of scarce resources anyway, but the importance of investing, which is geared towards sustainability and self-sustenance, is not something that is very prevalent in the country. Insecurity and humanitarian access, especially in regions like the Northeast with intense security challenges, insurgency, banditry, make it very difficult to deliver aid. And we've had several incidences, kidnapping, abduction, maiming, killing of aid workers in the Northeast as well. Donor conditionalities and policy autonomy. Foreign aid often comes with conditions. And sometimes those conditions include privatization, devaluation of the naira, our currency, maybe even mining of rare minerals, and access to health data of the population, which can limit the country's policy autonomy and prioritize donor interests over local needs. And so recent refusals of the America First aid package by Zambia and Zimbabwe highlight this. May I add that Nigeria was one of the first countries to sign up. Weak institutional frameworks, inadequate mechanisms for
Just thank you very much for that intervention. We've tried contacting you because of the time that we have tonight. It's quite short. So
yes, I'm actually rounding up. Yes, so that's
okay.
That in a nutshell, with the weak institutional frameworks and the domino effect on other countries, are what we're dealing with this foreign aid freeze. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak. one of the things I wanted to highlight was support for local manufacturing and agribusinesses, prioritizing health and education in budgets with exploration of innovative financing are some of the things that can be considered as opportunities for ODA to countries such as ours. Thank you once again.
Next panelist now, I'm introduced Indranil Chakrabarti. For over 30 years, I've been actively involved on issues of equity and solidarity, working with a variety of NGOs and civil society organisations. Before joining the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in 2005, he's held postings in several countries, including most recently as UK advisor to the Executive Director of the African Development Bank, shaping policy and investment strategies that drive inclusive growth. He is driven by the pursuit of social justice and the value of partnerships rooted in shared humanity and values to tackle global challenges. Indranil is currently leading on the organisation of a major international conference taking place this year on the future of international development and the role of partnerships. And it's with this in mind, Indranil will be speaking tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me along this evening. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with your guests tonight. So really, I wanted to build on what the first two speakers were saying and start by saying that international development assistance, overseas development assistance, has had a huge impact over the last 70 years. I was just looking up some stats before I came here this evening. Approximately 50% of a global reduction in infant mortality can be attributed to international development assistance. Aid has funded vaccination, which is perhaps the single biggest contributor to life expectancy. Both infant mortality and life expectancy have dropped significantly in the last 70 years. And if there is ever a question about what the impact of international development assistance has been, those two areas are very good examples to show that it's had a good impact and has made a big difference in people's lives. But what we're finding in our conversations increasingly is that the traditional approach to international development has started to come into decline. There's obviously, as you know, the references to the fall, the cuts in overseas development assistance, but also I think increasingly, in my career anyway, many of the countries that I started working on were low-income countries 25, 30 years ago, are increasingly becoming middle-income countries and upper-middle-income countries. So the nature of the relationship has changed and is changing. And I think what we hear is these countries are increasingly looking for a different type of partnership with countries like the UK, with so-called traditional donors. A relationship very much based on more horizontal dealings, in which the UK moves from being a donor to an investor, focusing very much on system strengthening and capacity building and sharing of expertise. And I think faced with the number of interrelated challenges, plus the geopolitical scenario that we're in, I think it's important for us to be thinking about different ways of continuing to address some of the urgent challenges that people in developing countries face. Challenges around health and humanitarian assistance, the interconnectedness between climate and a lot of humanitarian situations. And I think we also need to recognize that there are a number of new actors who are active in the field, who have new ideas, who have pioneered new inventions. I'm thinking particularly the role of technology, also the role of philanthropies, the increasing agency that developing country governments themselves in the global south want to have in terms of determining their own development path. And I think This is not to say that aid no longer has a role, but I think we need to think about development assistance differently in the current context. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Indranil. So finally, I'm moving to our fourth panelist this evening. Introduce Joanna Keating. Joanna is the Scottish Government's Head of International Development in its Directorate for External Affairs from March 2013 to date. A long-term civil servant, first as a government lawyer with a key focus on human rights law, constitutional law and EU law, and then policymaker. Joanna's career in the Scottish Government has had a strong focus on internationalism. As Head of International Development, Joanna is responsible for providing strategic leadership on the Scottish Government's international development and humanitarian work and programmes, and oversight of its International Development Fund. Joanna's role as head of the team is focused on building strong diplomatic relationships with the Scottish Government's partner governments, including leading on outcome in ministerial visits, including leading the recent inaugural visit by Scotland's First Minister to Zambia and Malawi in October 2025, where he visited health partnership programmes in both countries. Joanna will be speaking on the Scottish Government perspective on its contributions in this sector and what the future looks like in this space of development financing more generally.
Thanks very much, Matt. It's really lovely to be here and sharing panel with such esteemed colleagues as well, and really lovely to be with all of you. Thanks very much for turning up on a rather drizzly Tuesday night in Glasgow. So Scottish Government, for those of you, maybe I'll just give a little background first of all, for those of you that don't know much about the Scottish Government Development Programme. It's been running for 20 years, so the First Minister's recent visit to Malawi and Zambia was actually marking that anniversary of 20 years and marking the original signing of the cooperation agreement between the Scottish Government and the Malawian Government, signed at First Minister and presidential level, signed by Jack McConnell in 2005 as Scotland's then First Minister. And I think just saying that, actually, you know, there's that still to date, that really strong cross-parliamentary support, and it's something that, you know, is always recognised, that it was started under a Labour administration, like when there was Labour in Westminster as well, and carried on through the various administrations since then. So within the Scottish Parliament itself, there are cross-party groups on international development, cross-party groups on Malawi, and we also work very closely with FCDO, both in East Kilbride but mainly actually directly in our partner countries. So essentially, although, and this is where I get a bit lawyerly and sad because I've still got a keen interest in this, although the Scotland Act says that international development, international relations are reserved, there was a little caveat that was pulled out, which is that the Scottish Government is able to assist ministers of the Crown with international relations, including international development. So that's how the Scottish Government's international development programme, its footprint, was established in 2005. It was a £3 million programme for Malawi. Why Malawi? People often ask me, many reasons, but at the time, the team, which would have been my equivalents back then, looked across, and it was where were all the relationships with that Scotland had with other countries, and actually the biggest key, strongest relationship that they found was with Malawi and Zambia. Now, that comes, of course, very much from the days of Dr. David Livingstone. It comes from the original missionaries. That is not without its problems, you know, because, you know, even 20 years ago, it was very much about celebrating, you know, the march of Dr. David Livingstone, explorer, you know, sort of early humanitarian, looking to replace slavery with commercialisation. However, you know, it is a relationship that was, you know, is founded in colonialism, and that's something that we really try to recognise today in our relationships and in what we say about our partner countries as well. So from that, in 2005, the £3 million from Malawi. By 2008, we had the SNP come into administration. The budget was trebled at that point to 9 million, and new partner countries were added. There was another 6 added at that point. By 2014, I joined the team and took over in 2013. So 2014, we went into the Scottish independence referendum, and the decision in Scotland was to maintain the status quo constitutionally. But for that, we had been doing a lot of thinking about what would international development in an independent Scotland look like. And what we always looked at was that it would still be a small budget. You know, we'd be akin to Ireland or one of the Nordic countries, sort of Sweden, Finland, etc. So we're very much looking at those smaller funders. What makes Ireland? It's always ranked as a good donor. What made the Scandinavian countries good donors when you look at the Commitment to Development Index? So it's things about your wider policies, it's that beyond aid. So we started very much looking at, even in the current and ongoing constitutional settlement, with a very small budget, we were now about 10 million, 12 million at that point. You know, what could Scotland offer? So it was about working across government on areas like trade, working with health colleagues on global citizenship in the NHS, working with Police Scotland, etc. So today, we've been through over the last few years, 2020, I would say, was the next big element in our programme. 2016, we had been through a big public consultation. We cut down, reduced, refocused the number of partner countries to 4. So today, and that's maintained, our geographic focus is maintained with Malawi, Zambia, Rwanda in Africa, and we've maintained our Girls Scholarships programme in Pakistan, smaller but really nice programme in Pakistan. By 2020, of course, COVID came and we started looking at what did COVID mean for our partner countries, and really looking at, you know, issues around vaccine equity. At that point, we had Jenny Go-Ruth as our Minister for International Development, moving on then to Neil Gray, who of course now Cabinet Secretary for Health. But we're looking at areas around vaccine equity, and I think that's really where, you know, you've started to see those real demands from the Global South, really almost from that period onwards. It's around, how do we get a seat at the table? If there's something like COVID happens again, how does the Global South get a seat at the table? How do we make sure there's sharing of vaccines, sharing of other key elements, you know, even water resources? What are the answers on climate change, etc.? If you're not part of that sort of, you know, I guess the sort of structural reform that's needed, you know, in order for that transformation to take place. It's going to be a process. It's not going to be something that just suddenly happens. So from there, what we were doing, 2020, we had absolute discussions with our partner countries. What we were looking at was that real shifting power agenda. So it was looking at how did we respond to COVID, but also how did we respond to what was happening at that point. That was at the time, June 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement around the world. So we were looking at what did structural racism mean in international development sector. We're looking at what does it mean, you know, that phrase of white gaze was very much something that, you know, was being discussed quite openly. How did you support shifting power to partner countries? So what we did at that point, we were really looking at it from those two angles. So one was to refocus. We've already refocused geographically. We're now refocusing thematically. And so we looked at the areas that we were funding at that point, and then it was discussions with our partner country governments, where should we go in future? And we also co-wrote a set of new international development principles for all Scottish Government development work. Key of that is about partnership working. It's something Scottish Government had always, you know, really focused and emphasised about partnership working, but that was a key principle for moving forward. Also around inclusion, around advocacy, you know, all of these areas, transparency, but in particular being partner country led. And that ethos of shifting power. We also looked, so we were looking at what was our approach to international development, as well as what were the areas we'd be funding. So out of that review, we came that we wanted to have that real partner country-led development. We wanted to take a feminist approach. That's very much about the participatory approach, a human rights approach. So it all comes really around the same things of making sure that you are being partner country-led. So today that programme, our budget is increased at the moment. We've got a budget of 12.8 million per annum, so very small, you know, development funding still. But if you focus it well and you're working widely, and we're, you know, making sure we always have discussion with FCD1 countries, making sure we're not overlapping, that we are aligning, that we are, you know, very much fitting in with everything else that's happening in the countries. But key is those discussions with our partner countries. So the areas that we're now focused on, you know, we've heard from other panellists here tonight about health. One of the areas that we have ended up funding is on NCDs, non-communicable diseases. You know, they kill 75% of deaths around the world, and yet only 1 to 2% of ODA is actually focused on NCDs. Sadly, Scotland has got, you know, really expertise on these areas. As we know, in particular the west coast of Scotland, a lot of heart disease, diabetes, etc., stroke, cancers. So it's about sharing that information and peer-to-peer working with Malawi, Zambia. We've funded new research laboratories on NCDs, and we've also moved much more now into pooled funds. So the Health Sector Joint Fund in Malawi. So rather than our traditional approach where we're funding maybe 20 to 25 small health projects in Malawi, we've now opted into this pooled fund, and that allows the Malawian government, there's protections around the fund, but it allows the Malawian government to draw down funding specifically for NCDs. I think the other thing that we really notice is that as funding has dried up, again, there's almost that race for whatever funding is available. There's a lot of climate funding available. There's a lot of project funding still available, or there's still some project funding available. It means that things like women's rights organisations are losing their central focus. So one of the things that we've set up is a very small fund, but as a contribution against that is a new Women and Girls Fund. So that's now been in place for about 18 months, and it's funding specifically. The funding was designed by women in our partner countries. What kind of funding did they want? How should even the funding be allocated between them? So that's again about that feminist approach, and it's about looking at where are the areas of funding, where are the critical areas where there's so little funding, NCDs in health, disability education, women's rights in our education programme, and then in our equalities programme, funding for women's rights and also funding for gender-based violence. We fund Police Scotland to work with in a peer-to-peer approach with the police services of Malawi and Zambia. So again, it's very much about where can you take Scotland's expertise and provide that extra peer-to-peer learning between all of our partner countries and sharing of resources, whether that's knowledge or whether that is the funding. We are in difficult times. Our ministers have criticised the UK government cuts, welcoming that there has been extra funding provided for defence when it's needed, when the cuts were announced last year. But, our ministers have criticised and expressed grave concerns about, the cuts to ODA coming from UK government. First Minister, Matt's referred, we had a fantastic visit to Malawi and Zambia, first time since Jack McConnell's visit in 2005 to Malawi, and the first ever First Minister visit to Zambia in October. And, since he came back from that visit, First Minister said, first day back in Parliament, he wanted to make a statement to Parliament. The title of the statement was about the Scottish Government's commitment to international development. We've now just had our funds, our budget is being increased going into this new financial year 26-27. So the International Development Fund, which covers our development funding and humanitarian funding, is going up from 12.8 million to 16 million. We also are protecting, we've got a separate climate justice fund as well, which I can come on to say a little bit about as well, and that's been protected at 12.7. So we're going from about ODA spend, total Scottish Government ODA spend of about 25 million up to 28. And I should just say, of course, that is counted by UKG as part of the overall total for UK ODA. So that's a 25 at the moment, 28 as it will be, goes and counts as part of UK's ODA spend. So, but thanks very much. Really, I'm really happy to share more experiences. I should say, it's been quite unusual. I've been in post 13 years, which is a very long time. I'm just actually my closing months. I'm going to be moving on to a new post. And so it's been real privilege working within Scottish Government and international development and seeing that progressive changes that we've made through our ministers and, that real support of Scottish ministers for what we've done, and certainly working with FCDO colleagues as well. We're all civil servants and we work closely with them as well.
Thank you very much for that. Shall we give a round of applause to our panellists? Right, thank you very much for that. I think we've got just under 30 minutes for questions. So I think what I'll do is I'll collect a few questions, maybe collect 3 and just direct them to wherever they're at. So rather than Ben having to use his reserve list of questions, it's, if anybody would like questions. Maha, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Is there a mic that you want me to speak into, or you just want
It's come in.
Okay. Sorry, Robert. Okay. Maha Rafi Atal, Senior Lecturer in Political Economy. I guess this is a question really for anybody on the panel that wants to answer it, but I was struck in several of your remarks by the way that we kept coming back to kind of the intersection between kind of aid and other aspects of foreign policy, defense, security, thinking about periods of time when aid budgets from traditional donors were quite flush, but they were quite flush in part because aid was being directed, in the Nigerian case, for example, to the regions where donors were worried about Boko Haram recruitment. Thinking about FCDO, those of us who have been in this space for a long time know that the UK development functions have at times lived inside the Foreign Office and at other times lived in an independent agency. And at times there's been really close links between aid and other kind of national security objectives. And other times those things have been kind of more separate. Obviously, in the Scottish context, the question of what aspects of foreign policy kind of Scotland can act independently in, this keeps coming up. And yet, when each of you is talking about, okay, what is aid good for, right? How are we going to make a defense of it? None of that is what we come back to, right? The stuff that we come back to is this many people lifted out of poverty. These are the people who are alive today and wouldn't be if they hadn't had care when they were infants. These are the people that we're keeping out of famines. And so I guess I'd like to hear a little bit of reflection about to what extent the attempt at times to kind of keep aid alive by hitching it to other national security agendas, looking back now over this period and in this moment of real, to some extent, crisis for aid budgets, has that been a success?
Thank you. Do we have any more questions now, or anybody else? Yes, please.
Hi, everyone. I think I'm possibly asking the same question, but coming at it from a different angle. So something that I was, I should say, my name's Jess. I do actually work in aid, so I have a vested interest in all of this. I was really struck by the statement that aid has a PR problem, which it absolutely does. And so I'm curious to know from the panelists how we, sort of ideas for fixing that. So in terms of hitching it to those kind of greater geopolitical agendas, or hitching it to national security, or hitching it to, for example, stopping migration coming to the UK, I would say that those are largely failures because the electorate doesn't seem to understand that this is how aid is being directed, and those are the kind of purposes of it. So I suppose it's quite a broad question about, given that aid always seems to be the area where, when we want to increase defense spending, that's where we take it from. It's never seemed to be, decreasing aid spending has never seemed to be a kind of losing position for a political party. So how do we actually work to make the case for aid to the voting population in a country like the UK or Scotland more specifically? Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I guess since we're at it, yet a third take at the same question, which is basically, has the moral justification for aid changed, or is it changing?
So do you want to take those three and however you want to do it, and comment back? And I'll come back, Prince. Sorry, I couldn't see you for the structure. So yeah, whoever wants to start first. Want to go?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'll start if that's okay. Thank you very much for those questions. I think what we were all saying in our different ways was that aid has had an impact on lives and livelihoods across the global south. I think a particular take I was trying to make was that in the context of declining aid budgets, aid still has a role to play. But we are now in an increasingly complex environment. There are a plethora of actors out there. Overseas development assistance is unable to meet the massive financing needs which exist across the global south. And so therefore we need to think creatively, we need to think differently about how we use smaller amounts of official development assistance to catalyze significant investments and responses to existing and growing challenges around adapting to climate change, challenges around health, around humanitarian assistance. So I just want to kind of contextualize overseas development assistance in kind of the needs of the global south at the moment. Let me just give you a sense of what that is. In Africa alone, it's estimated that the infrastructure financing gap is in the region of $100 billion a year, right? A fairly conservative estimate. The estimate comes from the African Development Bank. That's just one continent of a number in the global south. And I think what that statistic reveals is that official development assistance by itself will only go a small way to addressing the massive infrastructure needs of just one continent. And so it's not about saying aid is good or aid is bad. It's about recognizing that it has a role, but so do other sources of development assistance. The role of finance, for example, the role of philanthropy, the role of technology. And so I think we need to, what I would say is just, we need to contextualize the future of aid in the context that the demands continue to grow, but we shouldn't just be seeing it as the role of official development assistance to meet those demands, but rather to catalyze other sources of financing to make a difference in the lives and the livelihoods of people in the developing world. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure, I'm happy to go next. I'll maybe take a different angle on it. I guess one of the things, because it's something we talk about a lot, you know, we discuss within the Scottish Government, we've discussed with colleagues in FCDO as well about, you know, how do you make the case better for the case for aid? How do you build that support for aid? I mean, I think one of the things we've always tried to do is actually try and build support for global citizenship within Scotland. You know, we sort of talk about global citizenship quite openly. Actually, our strategy, even going back to 2016, when we talked about refocusing the number of countries, and our strategy, the Scottish Government's live strategy, still is global citizenship, Scotland's international development strategy. So it's about, you know, how do you speak to people in Scotland about how and why they are part of a bigger global community? Why do things like climate change matter? Why does what we do in the global north affect people in the global south? Why do things like fair trade matter? You know, that we should be paying ethical prices for goods and services that we have. So it's about kind of, I suppose, like that national conversation almost. And we do that in various ways through, you know, those global citizenship learning for sustainability within Scotland schools. We do things through our support. We've had funding for organisations like Scotland's International Development Alliance, a networking body for the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, which supports things like school links, also in Malawi, the Malawi-Scotland Partnership. One of the other things that we've been doing over, I mean, I talked again a bit about the Beyond Aid and how we work across government. Since about 2016, we've been working really closely, for example, with health colleagues in the NHS. So, and we talked about global citizenship in the NHS. The NHS in Scotland is a huge employer. You've got a lot of people within the NHS, you know, who will go overseas, they will go and do volunteering. You also have a lot of staff within the NHS, you know, originated from other countries. So they're part of that global network within Scotland, within Scotland's NHS. They've actually done a really lovely set of resources, including documents called Doing It Well. And it's resources for NHS staff, and, you know, it's all online, you'll find it. And it talks about, you know, things like fair trade, about climate change, about, you know, how you can volunteer without even leaving your sofa or leaving your busy desk. How can you connect with other people? So I think it's about that sense of interconnectedness for people in Scotland. And I think that's probably about the best way possibly that you can do it. I don't think any of us have got any huge answers on it, but I think that's certainly one of the ways. It's about reminding people that we are all actually part of that global network. You know, we are connected to countries like Malawi. You think of, you know, in Scotland, you know, the number of schools that still have those partnerships, or churches and young people, universities will be, you know, students within Glasgow University that have all got connections with Malawi. We actually fund Glasgow University for some work in Malawi and Zambia as well. So I think there's definitely something about that concept of global citizenship and how you make the case for aid. But it's also about making sure we show impact, because at the end of the day, you know, it's public taxes that we're spending, we're always very conscious of that the aid budget the Scottish Government spends, it's additional coming from the Scottish Government's own budget. It could be spent on health and education. Our ministers are deciding to give that additional 25 million for international development and climate justice. So we need to make sure that we're doing good M&A. We need to make sure that we're showing impact, and we can say to people in Scotland, your taxes are being spent wisely. We need to be able to say to people in our partner countries, when we're spending within your communities will see the benefit. So I think it's about trying to prove up the model, but I think there's also something about global citizenship.
Thank you very much. Rulani, are you okay?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what my panelists have said. I also do believe it's around changing the narrative of aid. It's not that, you know, if you look at some of the imagery that's put out, it's not good imagery. You always have, you know, poor young Black kids with flies all around them, you know, that kind of imagery. So we need to change that and make people realize that that is one part of it. In the biggest scope of things, there are other parts of aid, for example, free trade, right? That actually do benefit and improve those kind of situations. And also driving that narrative that it's not about just helping those who are really, truly the most vulnerable, but also what happens in the global north affects what happens in the global south. So in some way, if we want to see a change within the global south, it's a good idea to partner with the global north. And I say partner, not necessarily that, and I like the Scottish approach that you are partnering as opposed to coming in and saying, this is what we want to do. You are rather taking it from the ground up and saying, what is it that you want to do? So I think flipping that narrative of how aid is viewed as opposed to making it, you have to do it because of these poor starving kids in Africa. No, rather that we are global citizens, and what happens in the one hemisphere affects in the other hemisphere. I also just want to go to the question of, is the moral justification of aid changing? And I think, Indra, you're kind of hinting to it, the kind of discussions that are already happening, you know, moving away from this thing of aid and ODA and rather looking at it from an investment perspective. If you look at what the EU is doing with the Global Gateway, they are focusing towards trade and how can this benefit us as well? Not just that we're giving away this money, but also what can we get from it? And I can't answer you if it's a change in the moral aspect of it, but there definitely is a shift in how a lot of these organizations are actually looking at aid. In the working in the field, there's always been that, yes, we will get something out of it, but it wasn't more as explicit as it is now. Now it's a very clear stated goal with the EU, with GIZ, that it has to benefit us as well. So in a way, I guess there is a bit of a shift in terms of the moral of it, but I don't know how, insofar as how much there has been a shift, but there is those kind of conversations that are already happening.
Yeah, I just want to say there's a plethora of innovation out there, and I think that we need to embrace that more and be much more inclusive of the organizations and partners that we work with to address these challenges, which are increasingly global challenges, not just challenges of the global south. I think one of the words that resonates for me out of tonight's discussion is that word of partnership. Less about being this sort of vertical top-down relationship between donor and beneficiary, but much more about sort of horizontal relationship. How can we move from being a donor to being an investor? How can we move from grants to expertise? One of the things that really struck me when I was at the African Development Bank was the realization of the amount of capital available in African countries themselves. Millions, billions of dollars available in pension funds in many African countries. And the challenge is often how to get those sources of capital to be invested in infrastructure, in health, in education, in those countries themselves. And I think unlocking some of that, as well as using the catalytic role of aid to unlock other sources of financing, blended finance, guarantees, others, I think That's the sort of areas that offers the opportunities of the future.
Fantastic. I'll bring Dr. Dize in a second, but I'll just gather quickly, because we've got about 15, 20 minutes left, gather quickly a last round of questions. So Prince, are you?
All right, so I'm Prince. I lecture at the University of Dundee. So I would start by asking the question, why is West Africa not really, within the priority geographies, of Scotland, in terms of funding? And that's one. And then the second question I would ask stems from this data from the Global Health Expenditure data released by the World Health Organization. And it says that aid covers 65% of health expenditure in Malawi. Out-of-pocket costs from the private market covers 22% and government covers 14%. In Rwanda, aid covers 43% of the total health expenditure. 21 comes from private citizens and 36 comes from government. In Nigeria, aid covers just 10% of the total health expenditure. Private pocket covers 75% of the total health expenditure. And then government covers about 15% of the total health expenditure. So the question is, why are we saying that in countries where we have more aid, we aren't seeing more responsibility from government? It should be a case where aid should nudge government, towards becoming more responsible. And the other question is, why is it that in countries like Nigeria, where you have citizens, and I think Dr. Adese can also, make response to this, citizens covering more of the health expenditure, but yet donors are the loudest, in such countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more? So I'll take 2 more questions and responses quick. Thank you. Thank you.
This is working. Thank you. It's Azra Meadows, University of Glasgow. From my experience in terms of having short-term funding for projects in Pakistan, I've done a lot of work there. I think it's the sustainability of these, outcomes. How can we keep them going and, making people more confident and self-sufficient in their own needs and building their capacity? The other question related to Pakistan was the Scottish government funding the women's scholarships. Now, these were given out to young girls to come out initially, to come out to the UK or to Scotland, but now they are just, allowing them to study in their own country. So I think that is not giving them the real experience in terms of gaining more, training and capacity building in their roles. The third point I had was public consultation. There used to be some public consultation. For example, in Pakistan, there were sort of groups. We were invited to tell the people who are working in the government in terms of the problems which are faced by the people on the ground in Pakistan. And I don't see much of these public consultations taking place. So I was wondering what the government is thinking on those grounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any last question at all? Yeah, one more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Henry. My question really borders around some of the terms that have been used here. I mean, the one that really caught my attention is the question on morality, or the term used on morality. And I'm thinking there about morality, the democratization of aid, as we've said, how local populations, especially in the global north, could think about their taxes going to fund what could seem like, again, moral interventions in the global south, and how they feel about those interventions. And there I'm thinking about accountability again, being that the perception of the residents or the citizens in the global south about foreign aid is pretty poor. They think the dominant perception is that their politicians are embezzling these funds. There's a high, the presentation from Nigeria talked about corruption, which is endemic. And what we don't get, in the news generally, are that there are sanctions from global funders, on these politicians and these countries. So there seems to be a kind of mismatch. And I think that mismatch is born out of the so-called concept of morality. If it's being done just as a largesse, then there would be little accountability. Could we think about creating that kind of sense where while you're doing these interventions, there's a very high sense of accountability through sanctions, especially as it borders on corruption? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've got about time for 1 minute responses each, but Dr. Adize, do you want to?
Yes, please. Thank you. I would like to speak to the question about West Africa and aid funding a smaller proportion of the health sector compared to out-of-pocket expenses. Now, in my intervention, I mentioned a very large informal sector, and this is one of the opportunities for overseas development assistance. How can you support West African governments such as Nigeria to harness and leverage those informal sectors in tax administration and capturing? That way you get them into the pool of health insurance. So the future of aid I foresee for countries like Nigeria is in technical assistance and supporting in building the systems that will enable national and state governments to be self-sustaining. That way there are clear results that you can actually show to say the Scottish people that this is the benefit of aid. The other thing would be agribusinesses and local domestic manufacturing of medicines and vaccines. How can we relate so that those products, as they're manufactured or grown within the continent, can be traded within the continent and even exported out to the global north? These are some of the opportunities. The problems are glaring, but as the African Union says, the future of aid should be reliant on action-oriented partnerships. And I'm happy all the speakers have lent their voices to that. Partnerships that are built on investing with mutual benefits and mutual agreement.
Thank you very much. Whoever wants to go more on.
I think there's a few questions for Scottish Government. I mean, one of the key questions about choice of partner countries, really. I mean, for the Scottish Government, as explained almost the history of our programme going back to 2005. We ran a public consultation in 2016 when we had 7 partner countries at that point. And we also asked the question then, are there other countries that we could and should consider? I mean, we've looked at this before about how do other donor countries choose partners, and generally there is some kind of either historical link. You're basing it first of all on need. So Malawi, for example, is one of the poorest countries in the world, but there's also those historical connections that makes it easier for people in Scotland to have that understanding of where is Malawi, and there are those relationships as well. So I think also, the Scottish Government's a very small donor, it's 25 million in total. We're a team of 10 in my team and another bit 8 doing climate justice work. So that's for the entirety of all 4 programmes in all of our partner countries. It's also doing the range of all of the things that FCDO does, whether that's safeguarding around fraud, etc., M&E, so it's everything. So it's really about ensuring the decisions we've made today, I guess, have been about making sure we're focused geographically and focused thematically in order to ensure that there's impact rather than trying to fund more countries. So I think I hope that answers the question on prioritisation of countries. The question around sustainability of projects, I mean, again, yes, that's always been an issue. I think we're always looking at exit strategies. What does success look like? What does sustainability look like? You can't fund projects forever. We have, over the last few years, again, just learning from experience and practice. Our projects used to be only 3 years. They're now sort of 5 to 6 years. We've got a couple of partners that are long-term partners that we said under our last review. One of the universities in Malawi, where taking forward things like a dental school, etc. Malawi's first crop of homegrown dental students, increasing those, and psychiatry students. So that's about that long-term. That's been a 20-year investment in Community University of Health Sciences. It used to be the College of Medicine in Malawi. So we've got somewhere we have these really long partnerships because we can see that there's that success over many years, and whether sustainability is needed to keep having, for example, those crops of graduates going through. But I think sustainability is always an issue. And Pakistan, there was questions around Pakistan scholarships. Basically, we've got around 400,000 we spend on Pakistan scholarships. We can put so many more girls through school and university if we keep them in the country. And it's also supporting the universities and the schools in Pakistan to have that, that expertise built there. Bringing just one student to Scotland to go to attend university, we could, help support 100 in Pakistan for that same price. So it's about that, again, about shifting power. It's about keeping people in their home countries, helping them shape their own future, supporting them to shape their own future.
Prince, to your question, I just want to make sure I understood it correctly. More aid means less responsibility for governments, right? So, and we in South Africa, we also have the same problem in that we also have a large population that's actually paying for private healthcare. Right now, there's discussions around having a similar NHS approach, but we call it NHI. So yeah, that's also how we're thinking about it. But in terms of what do we do around the fact that when there's aid, governments become more responsible? I think as people from the global south, we need to hold our leaders accountable, just like the other students said. We ourselves, we need to hold our governments accountable because we know what the challenges are. For the most part, I do, like Indra said, there is money in our countries, except we have a serious problem with corruption. I don't know how we now start to hold them accountable. Obviously, there's different ways of doing it, but I think that's where we need to start. And once we start to hold them accountable, and like I said, I'm not quite sure how we go about that, I think then what would happen is that in a way, aid then would not be such a big deal anymore in our countries. We'll be able to self-sustain as opposed to relying on other countries, on ODA in general, to fund certain functions that our governments can actually fund. And also, quite importantly, break that dependency on aid to run services that our governments should be running. And in terms of sustainability, like Joanne said, it's a problem. It's really quite a problem because the problem is that these interventions, they normally tend to be short-term, 3 to 5 years, right? And then if you're lucky, you get an extension in terms of funding. If you're not, that's the end of the project. From a monitoring and evaluation perspective, one thing that we've always built into it is the learnings. What are we learning from this that we can actually take forward? And this is why good M&E systems are very important. Well, they're very important in that as you are implementing, you are taking back the elements that can then be localized or kept or even run by the government or the municipality or whatever the context is to continue once the funding has left. But that's something that within international development, we don't actually do very well. It goes back to this dependence of, always thinking that there's always going to be funding and aid available. But as we see today, things are changing. So I think the learning elements of it is something that we need to do better within international development.
Thank you. Indranil, thank you.
Thanks very much. I won't keep you much longer. I'm conscious it's midweek, it's a cold evening. You probably want to go back to your homes. Thank you very much for coming out tonight and for being part of the audience for this event. I'm going to try and pick up a couple of questions very quickly, and I'm going to end by talking about domestic resources. So picking up on Prince's point, I'm a gentleman with a scarf at the back's point, and my apologies, I've forgotten your name. Has a moral case for aid been lost? No, but I think increasingly it is being politically contested. We need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There have been very real concrete gains made over the last 70 years. Some of these are now at risk, but the reality is that the world is changing and we need to rethink our approach in response to that. We need to respond better, more comprehensively to complex, interrelated challenges. We need to be more inclusive and embrace a broader coalition of diverse actors who have a lot to offer in the space of development by providing solutions, proven solutions, to some of the most pressing global problems that we face. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. I just want to finish on the issue of domestic resources, because you've both mentioned it, and some of our panelists have mentioned it as well. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that domestic resources are really actually very key in solving some of the most intractable development challenges in the global south. Domestic resources finance essential services. They strengthen sovereignty. They reduce reliance on external flows, which, as we've heard, are waning. And they build state capacity. All these sorts of things that our people in the audience have mentioned tonight. It's not a panacea, but it's certainly a very significant contributor to all those issues. And I think we need to think about fiscal resilience partnerships. And what I mean by that, this is very much Matt's specialism, but it's about supporting countries to reach a consensus on fiscal reform, which is backed by its politicians. I think the role then for the international community is to support these reforms, and where possible and where there is demand, to coordinate efforts to build capability on those reforms. And I think this would create a virtuous cycle, which would start to address the issues about domestic responsibility, domestic resources, accountability, transparency, which many of you have noted tonight as some of existing challenges around international development assistance. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So it leaves me to just say thank you to our panelists, Indranil, Joanna, Lani, and Dr. Adizi. Thank you very much for everybody coming along as well. It's fantastic turnout. Thank you to the Stevenson's Trust as well for supporting this, to Robert and Connor for sorting all this out tonight. So yeah, thank you very much, and a final round of applause for our panelists.